Topic for our speakers. Let's listen in as the adventure begins with a question about the Bible's authenticity.
How do we know the Bible's true?
Well, let me try to make a couple of suggestions, and then Ravi will come and give you a more meaningful answer. When you raise the question of truth, in this context you're raising two things. Firstly, is there some kind of measurement which can be employed in order to see whether what is actually stated in there is accurate or not? Now, because the Christian faith claims to be an historical faith, in other words, rooted and grounded in history, not describing mythical events which somehow have allegorical meaning which you can then apply to a reality, but actually describing and interpreting the reality, one of the ways you can start is by saying, well, did the things it says took place, did they actually take place or not? So that would be an important first question to ask. Now, so one of the ways you could begin to say about it is, are there historical statements in it? Is there any kind of archaeological evidence, historical evidence to support and sustain them? Now, clearly I'm going to stand before you and say that there is. If you want to read it, a colleague of mine called Orr-Ewing has written a book on this subject. In England it's called Why Trust the Bible? I think in the States it's published as Is the Bible Intolerant?, which actually is one of the heading chapters from within the book. But the theme of the book is why can it actually be trusted? Now the second thing to do would be then to say, is it, let's say, politically accurate as well? If it's describing history and it's describing its political geography, which it also does, are there grounds to suspect that that is actually correct? So then you can begin to employ that kind of measure. You could also employ other types of measures where you can say, does this actually make sense? And is it clearly understood what it's trying to say? Because many people today would actually say, okay, look, the Bible may be historically accurate, but isn't capable of 1,000 different interpretations, and therefore, everyone's got their own individual one. All I'd just like to say is, because there is such a wealth of material written and published on this, is that you're better off, if you're wanting to honestly find the answer to that question, doing some reading and then asking some very difficult questions. Amy herself, who works with me in Europe, when she did her undergraduate degree in theology at the University of Oxford, and if you're not familiar with the University of Oxford, we're a reasonably good university, and we're a very secular institution. And Amy, in her final year as an undergraduate, got a perfect score in her Greek paper. She got a perfect score in her other two papers, and she almost failed the fourth. The fourth paper was on the historical reliability of the gospel accounts and Jesus' claim to divinity, that he said he was God. In her essay, she had argued that the Gospels were indeed reliable and Jesus clearly claimed to be God. Now, it's very unusual for an undergraduate to be given what's called a viva, which is an oral examination where you are quizzed in front of your professors orally. It's very, very unusual. It happens a couple of times, maybe every decade. But because she got perfect scores in her other three papers, her tutor said, how is it possible for someone who was so brilliant there to fail so drastically here? So in front of the 13 most senior professors of theology at the University of Oxford, Amy had to defend what she had written in her undergraduate exam. The end of that, I was going to use the word inquisition, that's not the word I'm really looking for. At the end of that examination process, they awarded her the highest mark they could give her. And as she went to leave, the head of department came to her and said, the reason you almost failed that exam was that in the exam you destroyed the marking professor's entire life's work. In other words, you argued academically and archaeologically that there was a basis to all of these things and it could be established academically. So that's why we've given you the highest mark we can award you. Many people go through this world thinking that it would be ludicrous, that you'd really have to have lost, in England we'll say lose your marbles. I don't know, do you play with marbles here? Sort of a couple of tiddlywinks short of a stack, I don't know, whatever the American equivalent is. In order to claim to have a thinking mind, a critical mind, and also to believe that somehow the Bible is accurate. But I would want to put it back to you to say, if you're so sure, then by all means do some reading, come back with some specifics. I'll be very happy to talk with you, because if you can certainly come up with something that you think is so sure, two things will come out. One, I'll have to ask myself some very serious questions, and secondly, you'll make a lot of money because you would have found something that hasn't been found hitherto. And so I would encourage you to ask those kinds of questions. Don't just simply sit here and listen to me talking in this kind of manner and say, yes, of course, now we believe you. Go away, do the reading, do the research, look into it, find out whether it's actually true. That is one of the ways in which you will begin to discover whether or not the Bible actually is true or not.
First, the very nature of revelation is not just propositional. It is embodied, it is incarnated. But let's go to the propositional side, because the question was raised, and I think your question is a very critical one. On this peg hangs just about everything the Christian believes. It is this. It's a fellow was once doing his PhD dissertation, and he disagreed with the way dissertations were judged. So he would say things like this. He would make some profound statement and say, as told to me by the waiter on Fifth Avenue's restaurant. And then he would make another statement, as told to me by the elevator boy in such and such a place. And they were all verbal references to somebody he talked to. So the professor looked at him and said, you can't make statements like this in a dissertation. You have to have written references or footnotes. And he said, aha, why? Why do you have to have it as written? Why is it more important because it's written rather than the waiter telling me in a restaurant or the elevator man telling me? So the professor said, okay, that's all right. Just wanted to see where you're coming from. On the day he was graduating, he said, we have passed you and given you your PhD, but we're not going to give it to you in writing. Just take my word for it. There's something about the inscripturation process that is very important, because truth is primarily a property of propositions. When you look at the Bible, it is a very distinctive book. Unlike Buddha's teachings, which are the sermons of Buddha, or the Quran, which is the utterance of one man and the compilation of it posthumously, this takes 66 books from about the mid-1400s all the way to the first century. And you've got this 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New. And you've got a single thread going through all of this. The collusion factor would have had to be incredible to bring this about. For example, you go back to the prophecy of Isaiah, writing 700 before Christ, to talk about the virgin birth, to talk about Micah talking about the city where he would be born, and Zacharias talking about the way that the Messiah would ultimately be crucified. You take these writers, some of whom were not contemporaries, and you put all the converging line of evidence. You take the hundreds of those prophecies and bring them into the person of Jesus Christ. It would have taken an extraordinary stroke of genius to retroactively bring all of that to the convergence in one single person. Now, the authority of Christ hangs on the resurrection. If those who wanted to disprove the authority of Christ, they could have done it in one simple stroke. And if Christ were a charlatan, he could have done it in one simple statement. You know what he could have said? I will rise again spiritually. You would never have been able to falsify that statement. Because after he died, you'd have said the body is there. He said, yeah, but he said he would rise spiritually. That's not what Jesus said. Jesus said he would rise again bodily. Which means if the body of Christ had been presented, his entire authority would have been decimated. The resurrection factor became key in the retroactive authentication of the Old Testament. Virtually every book of the Old Testament was quoted by him, I think, with the exception possibly of the book of Esther or so. But you've got the books of the major prophets, the minor prophets, the Pentateuch and so on, authoritatively quoted. Now you take all of that and bring it into the point of testing. You first have to say this: how do I know it is not true? You would have to give a series of contradictions or historically false statements to say this is unacceptable here. That is a simpler way. You could just say, look, it says this is such and such a city, so many miles away from here. They'd never existed, and what did exist was 100 kilometers from there. You could begin to falsify it very quickly if there was such falsification possible. After 2,000 years of Christ's incarnation, 3,500 years since the inscripturation process, I want to say this to you. No book has been more studied. No book has been more scrutinized. And of all the places of studies, Princeton, which is hardly a bastion of conservatism today, Dr. Bruce Metzger, possibly the greatest New Testament scholar in recent memory in America, and F.F. Bruce, the greatest New Testament scholar in England of recent memory from Manchester, have both arrived at the same conclusion, that the documents and the authority of the Bible totally reliable. In fact, Metzger went so far as to say 99.4% of what we have in the Bible today has been corroborated along as you go back across time with the extant copies available early in history.